My dear students, hello. I welcome you all in our series of lectures on cybersecurity. Today, we are going to learn about access control. So, let us begin with access control. Access control is any mechanism by which a system grants or revokes the right to access some data or perform some action. Normally, a user must first log into a system using some authentication system. Next, the access control mechanisms controls what operations the user may or may not make by comparing the user ID to an access control database. In computer security, general access control includes authorization, authentication, access approval and audit. A more narrow definition of access control would cover only access approval, whereby the system makes a decision to grant or reject an access request from already authenticated subject based on what the subject is authorized to access. Authentication and access control are often combined into a single operation, so that access is approved based on successful authentication or based on an anonymous access token. Authentication methods and tokens include passwords, biometric scans, physical keys, electronic keys and devices, hidden paths, social barriers and monitoring by humans and automated systems. Access control systems include number 1, file permissions such as create, read, edit or delete on a file server. Number 2, program permissions such as the right to execute a program on an application server. Number 3, data rights such as the right to retrieve or update information in a database. Next is software entities. In any access control model, the entities that can perform actions on the system are called subjects, and the entities representing resources to which access may need to be controlled are called objects. Subjects and objects should both be considered as software entities rather than as human users. Any human users can only have an effect of the system, while the software entities that they control. Although some systems equate subjects with user IDs, so that all processes started by a user by default have the same authority. This level of control is not fine-grained enough to satisfy the principle of least privilege, and arguably is responsible for the prevalence of malware in such systems. In some models, for example, the object capability model, any software entity can potentially act as both subject and object. Access control models tend to fall into one of the two classes, one based on capabilities and another based on access control lists. In a capability based model, holding an unforgettable reference or capability to an object provides access to the object. Access is conveyed to another party by transmitting such a capability over a secure channel. In an ACL based model, a subject's access to an object depends on whether its identity appears on a list associated with the object. Access is conveyed by editing the list. Different ACL systems have a variety of different conventions regarding who or what is responsible for editing the list and how it is edited. Both capability based and ACL based models have mechanisms to allow access rights to be granted to all members of a group of subjects. There is an important concept in the case of capability based model, and that is capability based security. Capability based security is a concept in the design of a secure computing system, one of the existing security models. A capability is a communicable, unforgettable token of authority. It refers to a value that references an object along with an associated set of access rights. A user program on a capability based operating system must use a capability to access an object. Capability based security refers to the principle of designing user programs such that they directly share capabilities with each other according to the principle of least privilege, and to the operating system infrastructure necessary to make such transactions efficient and secure. Capability based security is to be contrasted with an approach that uses hierarchical protection domains. Although most operating systems implement a facility which resembles capabilities, they typically do not provide enough support to allow for the exchange of capabilities among possibly mutually untrusting entities to be the primary means of granting and distributing access rights throughout the system. A capability based system, in contrast, is designed with that goal in mind. Next is services. Access control systems provide the essential services of authorization, identification, authentication, access approval and accountability, where identification and authentication ensure that only legitimate subjects can log on to a system, where access approval grants access during operations by association of users with the resources that they are allowed to access based on authorization policy, and accountability identifies what a subject did. Then is authorization. Authorization involves the act of defining access rights for subjects. An authorization policy specifies the operations that subjects are allowed to execute within a system. Most modern operating systems implement authorization policies as formal sets of permissions that are variations or extensions of three basic types of access. Number 1, read. In it, the subject can read file contents and list directory contents. Number 2, write. The subject can change the contents of a file or directory with operations such as add, update, delete and rename. Number 3, execute. In it, if the file is a program, the subject can cause the program to run. These rights and permissions are implemented differently in systems based on discretionary access control and mandatory access control. Now, let us discuss in detail about identification and authentication. Identification and authentication is the process of verifying that an identity is bound to the entity that makes an assertion or claim of identity. The identification and authentication process assumes that there was an initial validation of the identity, commonly called identity proofing. Various methods of identity proofing are available, ranging from in-person validation using government issued identification to anonymous methods that allow the claimant to remain anonymous, but known to the system if they return. The method used for identity proofing and validation should provide an assurance level commensurate with the intended use of the identity within the system. Subsequently, the identity asserts an identity together with an authenticator as a means for validation. The only requirements for the identifier is that it must be unique within its security domain. Authenticators are commonly based on at least one of the 4 factors. Number 1, something you know, such as password or a personal identification number. This assumes that only the owner of the account knows the password or PIN needed to access the account. Number 2, something you have, such as smart card or security token. This assumes that only the owner of the account has the necessary smart card or token needed to unlock the account. Number 3, something you are, such as fingerprint, voice, retina or iris characteristics. Number 4, where you are, for example, inside or outside a company firewall or proximity of login location to a personal GPS device. Next is access approval. Access approval is the function that actually grants or rejects access during operations. During access approval, the system compares the formal representation of the authorization policy with the access request to determine whether the request shall be granted or rejected. The access evaluation can be done online. Now, let us move on to accountability. Accountability uses system components as audit trails and logs to associate a subject with its actions. The information recorded should be sufficient to map the subject to a controlling user. Audit trails and logs are important for detecting security violations and recreating security incidents. If no one is regularly reviewing your logs and they are not maintained in a secure and consistent manner, they may not be admissible as evidence. Many systems can generate automated reports based on certain predefined criteria or thresholds known as clipping levels. For example, a clipping level may be set to generate a report for more than 3 failed login attempts in a given period, or any attempt to use a disabled user account. These reports help a system administrator or security administrator to more easily identify possible break-in attempts. Next is various access control models. Access control models are sometimes categorized as either discretionary or non-discretionary. The most widely recognized models are discretionary access control models, mandatory access control, role based access control, intent based access control, emotion based access control, attribute based access control, and break-in glass access control. MAC is non-discretionary. Let us understand them one by one. Number 1, discretionary access control. In discretionary access control, a policy is determined by the owner of an object. The owner decides who is allowed to access the object and what privileges they have. Two important concepts DAC are: number 1, file and data ownership. Every object in the system has an owner. In most DAC systems, each object's initial owner is the subject that caused it to be created. The access policy for an object is determined by its owner. Number 2, access rights and permissions. These are the controls that an owner can assign to other subjects for specific resources. Access controls may be discretionary in ACL based or capability based access control systems. In capability based systems, there is usually no explicit concept of owner, but the creator of an object has a similar degree of control over its access policy. Second access control model is mandatory access control. Mandatory access control refers to allowing access to a resource if and only if rules exist that allow a given user to access the resource. It is difficult to manage, but its use is usually justified when used to protect highly sensitive information. Examples include certain government and military information. Management is often simplified over what can be required if the information can be protected using hierarchical access control or by implementing sensitivity labels. What makes the method mandatory is the use of either rules or sensitivity labels. Let us discuss them one by one. Number 1, sensitivity labels. In such a system, subjects and objects must have labels assigned to them. A subject sensitivity label specifies its level of trust. An object sensitivity label specifies the level of trust required for access. In order to access a given object, the subject must have a sensitivity level equal to or higher than the requested object. Number 2, data import and export. Controlling the import of information from other systems and export to other systems is a critical function of these systems, which must ensure that sensitivity labels are properly maintained and implemented so that sensitive information is appropriately protected at all times. Two methods are commonly used for applying mandatory access control. Number 1, rule based or label based access control. This type of control further defines specific conditions for access to a requested object. A mandatory access control system implements a simple form of rule based access control to determine whether access should be granted or denied by matching an object's sensitivity label and subject's sensitivity label. Number 2, lattice based access control. These can be used for complex access control decisions involving multiple objects and subjects. A lattice model is a mathematical structure that defines greatest lower bound and least upper bound values for a pair of elements, such as a subject and an object. In computer security, lattice based access control is a complex access control model based on the interaction between any combination of objects, such as resources, computers and applications and subjects, such as individuals, groups or organizations. In this type of label based mandatory access control model, a lattice is usually used to define the levels of security that an object may have and that a subject may have access to. The subject is only allowed to access an object if the security level of the subject is greater than or equal to that of the object. Mathematically, the security level access may also be expressed in terms of the lattice, which is a partial order set, where each object and subject have a greatest lower bound and least upper bound of access rights. For example, if two subjects A and B need access to an object, the security level is defined as the meet of the levels of A and B. In another example, if two objects X and Y are combined, they form another object Z, which is assigned the security level formed by the join of the levels of X and Y. Third access control model is role based access control. Role based access control is an access policy determined by the system, not by the owner. Role based access control is used in commercial applications and also in military systems, where multi-level security requirements may also exist. Role based access control differs from DAC in that DAC allows users to control access to their resources, while in role based access control, access is controlled at the system level outside of the user's control. Although role based access control is non-discretionary, it can be distinguished from mandatory access control primarily in the way permissions are handled. Mandatory access control controls read and write permissions based on a user's clearance level and additional levels. Role based access control controls collections of permissions that may include complex operations such as an e-commerce transaction or may be as simple as read or write. A role in role based access control can be viewed as a set of permissions. Three primary rules are defined for role based access control. Number 1, role assignment. A subject can execute a transaction only if the subject has selected or been assigned a suitable role. Number 2, role authorization. A subject's active role must be authorized for the subject. With rule 1 above, this rule ensures that users can take on only roles for which they are authorized. Number 3, transaction authorization. A subject can execute a transaction only if the transaction is authorized for the subject's active role. With rules 1 and 2, this rule ensures that users can execute only transactions for which they are authorized. Additional constraints may be applied as well, and roles can be combined in a hierarchy where higher level roles subsume permissions owned by lower level sub-roles. Next is intent based access control. Intent based access control is a novel access control model that detects the intention of the user requesting access, answering the question why access is being requested as opposed to the current access control systems that ask who is requesting access. Intent based access control is designed to prevent the insider threat as opposed to the current access control systems that are designed to prevent the outsider threat. Intent based access control is a risk based access control that assesses risk of access based on the detected intent and the motivation level towards executing that intent. Intent based access control takes advantage of the robustness of P300 based concealed information test to detect an intent of access and uses the brain signals to detect the motivational level. Sixth access control model is emotion based access control model. Emotion based access control detects the emotion of the user requesting access in order to form an access decision. This form of access control adds the sensitivity aspect to access control systems to further analyze the risk of granting an authorized user access. A user who has high level of anger and might cause damage if grant access as well as denying a malicious authorized user access can be useful. Granting a non-authorized user who have good intentions of access can be useful as well. In some cases, we would wish to deny access to authorized personals in the case that they request access to cause damage. On the other hand, we would wish to grant access to unauthorized individuals who may suppress damage or prevent catastrophic incidents. Emotional based access control uses emotion detection technology to supplement the access control systems by detecting the emotion of the person requesting access and using it as an additional authentication factor along with the recognized identity of the user as needed. The novelty of the approach is that access is granted based on the actual feelings of the users with regards to the requested resources. The approach is based on detection of emotion based on the involuntary brain signals that are extremely hard to control or circumvent, and on using the detected emotion in the context of access control. Number 7, attribute based access control. Attribute based access control defines an access control paradigm whereby access rights are granted to users through the use of policies which combine attributes together. The policies can use any type of attributes, user attributes, resource attributes or environmental attributes. Attribute values can be set valued or atomic valued. Set valued attributes contain more than one atomic values. In attribute based access control, access is granted not based on the rights of the subject associated with the user after authentication, but based on the attributes of the user. The user has to prove so called claims about his attributes to the access control engine. An attribute based access control policy specifies which claims need to be satisfied in order to grant access to an object. For instance, the claim could be older than 18. Any user that can prove this claim is granted access. Users can be anonymous when authentication and identification are not strictly required. One does, however, require means for proving claims anonymously. This can, for instance, be achieved using anonymous credentials. Digital credentials are the digital equivalent of paper based credentials. Just as a paper based credential could be a passport, a driver's license, a membership certificate or some kind of ticket to obtain some service such as cinema ticket or a public transport ticket, a digital credential is a proof of qualification, competence or clearance that is attached to a person. Also, digital credentials prove something about their owner. Both types of credentials may contain personal information such as the person's name, birthplace, birth date or biometric information such as a picture or a fingerprint. Sometimes passwords or other means of authentication are referred to as credentials. In operating system design, credentials are the properties of a process such as its effective user ID that is used for determining its access rights. Often, however, digital credentials like digital cash are only associated with anonymous digital credentials. Such credentials, while making an assertion about some property, status or right of their owner, do not reveal the owner's identity. Still, the basic concept of credential must be disassociated with either anonymous or identified. Now, the last model is that we are going to discuss is break glass access control model. Traditionally, access has a purpose of restricting access. Thus, most access control models follow the default deny principle, that is, if a specific access request is not explicitly allowed, it will be denied. This behavior might conflict with the regular operations of a system. In certain situations, humans are willing to take the risk that might be involved in violating an access control policy if the potential benefits that can be achieved outweighs this risk. This need is especially visible in the healthcare domain, where a denied access to patient records can cause the death of a patient. Break glass, also called break the glass, try to mitigate this by allowing users to override access control decisions. Break glass can either be implemented in an access control specific or a generic manner. So, with this our lecture is over. Concluding our lecture, today we learnt about access control models, services and entities associated with controlling the access to services. Hope you understood today's lecture. In the next lecture, we will learn about file protection and associated techniques. Till then, goodbye. Have a nice day.